Alright, let's get started. For those who might be new, I guess I'll talk about tools real quick before I start. So I do all of my comics traditionally with pen and ink, watercolor. I'm not going to get to watercolor on the stream today. If you'd like to see my watercolor process, I work on it for last Sunday's stream. That video on demand is up now for all patrons in the Wolf and Wraith tiers. And there will be future public live streams where I'll work on watercolor. But for today, for the inks, I've got this lovely dip pen and handle. I'm using a G-nib dip pen. It's got a nice little flex to it. This is a customized nib handle that I ordered a while back. It's like nice and chunky, so it's like good for your wrist. You're not like gripping it a little thin thing too tight. And then I'm using an FW acrylic artist's ink. I've filled out this like little antique inkwell. And I like that ink because it goes on real smooth, and then once it's dry, it's waterproof, so I can watercolor over it easily. So let's get started here. I'm making some pretty good progress on this comic. If you are on the Patreon, we are a pretty good ways into Chapter 1. This particular page I'm inking is a little bit into Chapter 2. But I'm really excited with how it's going so far. Thank you so much to everyone who's been reading it and you know, the kind words you've shared. If you are not in a position to contribute to the Patreon and would still like to read the story, don't worry, it's going to be launching publicly on August 19th. So very, very soon. You can read the teaser comic now at sablecomic.com. This is a very contorted, angry face that Teddy's making. He doesn't make a whole lot of happy faces. It is technically, it is a horror story. So there's not a lot of smiling, but he'll get there. Spoilers, Matt says. Yes, well, a little bit. I try not to do any like super spoiler heavy pages, at least for the live stream. If you're on the Patreon, you've already been introduced to this character. Not in the story itself, but I've been sharing a lot of, like, the months before leading up to the launch on Patreon, I was sharing a lot of, works in progress and sketches and character sheets and things, so they already know a little bit about who this very imposing wolf is. You can see that this ink goes on really nice and smooth. And like I said, once it's dry, it'll be waterproof, so I can paint over it without worrying about it smearing. I'm still kind of getting used to... I like to draw a lot of like anthropomorphized animals in my free time. This is my first time doing it in a professional capacity for an actual book project. And I'm still kind of getting used to the logic of like how the head shapes work. Just because if you add something like a snout, things like his mouth shape here work differently in 3 dimensions than like a human-shaped face would. Just because like the face is more oblong, it kind of like pulls up a little bit more at the corners. J.A. Aldridge asks, does it take a long time for the ink to dry? Oh, just my family's all in the chat today. No, not really. That's what's nice about this particular ink is what I'm drawing right here will probably be dry within about 5 minutes. It goes really, really quick. Which is important to how I like to work because, I'm kind of just going through the entire page day after day. And so I don't want like a ton of just downtime where I'm just sitting on my hands waiting for ink to dry, and so this ink dries really, really quick. Oop. I don't know if you can see it on the stream, but I've caught a little dog hair here in the ink. It's the troubles of having a kind of a sheddy dog, is sometimes his hair gets caught in the ink in the paint. I'll move that out once the ink is more dry, so I move it. Oh, there it goes. The trouble is if I try to move that dog hair while the ink's still wet, it could smear the ink, and I could accidentally like draw with it. So this character, this is Teddy. He's the protagonist of the book. He's got a very short fuse. Definitely has some anger management issues. But the character he's talking to also has a short fuse and anger management issues, so, you know. They spend a lot of time understanding each other, but also yelling at each other. That's just the way it goes sometimes. I try to make sure that I have a really tight pencil drawing for the bits that are really important. So things like faces, where there's going to be a lot of reader attention, or things that are kind of complicated to draw, like hands. But other than that, I like to keep my pencils pretty loose. There's this really common problem that a lot of illustrators will complain about, where you'll feel like the pencil sketch has a lot of energy, but then once you ink it, it kind of like kills it. It feels very like flat and lifeless. And so I try to keep the majority of my pencils pretty loose so that I can get a lot of that first drawing energy in the inks. And sometimes that leads to like mistakes and things, and a lot of times those mistakes are fine, and that's kind of what gives it that life, and I can leave it in. Every once in a while I'll have to go in Photoshop and fix a line or something. If you see my hand like going off there to reset, it's because I'm dipping it in the inkwell. The pen nibs hold ink for a good while. You'll see that I can go for a good amount of time without having to do it, but with things like fountain pens and ballpoint pens, the sort of problem that those inventions were trying to solve was the fact that you had to constantly kind of go and dip and reset with a dip pen. The reason I like to still use dip pens is you can get a nice amount of line variety out of them, more so than with regular pens. You can get almost a kind of a brush-like line quality while still having the control of a pen. And I find that dip pens have a very specific kind of scratchy look to them that a lot of modern readers associate with old fairy tales and storybooks, which are big influences on me. And so just drawing with a dip pen can kind of give it that texture and evoke that sense for a reader. I also do ink with a fountain pen. I don't know that I will use it at all on the page today. I typically ink with my fountain pen if it's like something that's going to require a lot of very tiny, fine detail, or it's a little more rigid, like a building structure. This is a pretty like close-up, character-centric page. Maybe I'll use the fountain pen for the face right here. That's a little small, but it's dip pen day. Sorry for spinning it on you. I'm trying to do this like sort of radial action lines to really drive home that he's shouting here. But I did it starting from the wrong side, and I don't want to like smear my hand across the wet ink. But going back to the earlier question, like if it's dry, like his face is already dry, and I just drew that. Oh, except for that one bit on his hair that I just goofed. Oops. That's what I get for trying to show off. So that's an example of a thing that I'm just going to Photoshop out later. add a little bit more hatching here just to like really create some depth and visual interest. These kind of little hatch marks are some of my favorite parts of drawing because, you know, they're very low risk. If I mess them up, it's not gonna mess with like the clarity of the drawing. Hi, Erica. What is a family reunion in the chat today? And it's, I don't know, it's very soothing just to like make marks on paper, you know, just like little lines or squiggles or whatever. And I find they add a lot of like texture and liveliness to a drawing. It kind of gives a drawing a very like worn, lived-in look. There we go. I did this in the right direction this time. I also love the language of comic books, like the visual language of it. So like these little lines, plus his expression lets you know that he's yelling. But these lines do a lot to sort of communicate that he's like, not just snarling, like he's shouting. And we just know visually that like these lines communicate that. You can do a similar thing with these radial lines with other expressions. So if he had a bit more of like a shocked expression on his face, it would really like drive home that feeling. But I like these little visual tricks that have developed in the medium over the years to communicate things like sound and emotion, you know, things you can't necessarily do visually. Do you like drawing or writing more? That's a good question. Probably drawing a bit more. It's a little bit more what I'm used to. I have a little more training in it. But I really do like writing. What's nice about what I do for a living is, you know, I'm an author illustrator, and so I can switch back and forth. You know, and if I don't have pressing deadlines, I can kind of switch back and forth as I want, as my interests dictate. And so, you know, I'll definitely get tired of drawing. I'll say that drawing is way more physically tiring than writing. Writing is a little more mentally exhausting, but drawing's more physically tiring. So it just kind of depends on what I have the energy for. Writing's also nice because, you know, if I'm writing something like one of the Deep Haven books, which for people who aren't familiar with my work is a Gothic mystery series that I write. It's illustrated prose, not a comic. I can describe, you know, in a paragraph this really ornate, beautiful Gothic structure, and I don't then have to worry about, like, you know, drawing it, perspective, drawing details, keeping things consistent, things like that. I can just say, oh, it's very ornate and beautiful, and then it just is in the mind of the reader, you know, if I describe it well. So that's nice. But drawing is a lot of fun. There is something to like being able to pull exactly what's in my head out of it and to show readers. And like I said, it's a little less, I find it a little less like mentally taxing to draw. It's easier just to like put on a podcast or an audiobook and just like turn my brain off, you know, just zone out and make marks. Whereas with writing, I have to be very focused in on what I'm doing, like at all times. I'm I'm still not quite used to drawing this character. Who's not as centered as I need to remember to keep an eye on the screen so I can see what you guys are seeing. This old wolf character, I've practiced with him a lot in my sketchbook, but this is just after his introduction to the story. And so I'm still kind of getting used to drawing him. He's got his own specific shapes that I'm still kind of learning. That's the thing with like working on comics, is a lot of it's just learning the shape language of a character. And you know, it's easy. It's good to think about that kind of thing when you're in the concept art stage of, you know, what are the shapes? What's going to make a very instantly recognizable silhouette, so that if I draw this character really, really small, that, you know, the reader's going to be able to still instantly recognize who it is. And like, what shapes am I going to be? What details and shapes am I going to be physically able to draw? You know, hundreds, if not thousands, of times. And so that's kind of a lot of the thinking that goes into the character design phase. But a lot of the times, even if I practice like drawing the characters from different angles and different poses and expressions in my sketchbook, which is a lot of what I'm doing while I'm writing out a script for a story, I still don't really have a good handle on how to draw them until I start drawing them regularly in the story. So it's probably not visible to anyone but me, but the earliest drawings of a character are always way rougher and a little more inconsistent than, you know, the drawings of them a chapter later. I usually feel like I've gotten a really good handle on how to draw a character right as I'm like finishing up drawing the book. It's almost always how it goes. Let's see. We're going to do some hatch lines here. This is all going to be kind of like filled in spot black with a brush. I'll do that later. Do I think writing is harder than illustration? That's a really good question. I think it's very subjective. There's definitely days where I find one harder than the other. I don't know. I guess it kind of depends on what you're writing and what you're drawing. Like, it's way easier, to go back to an earlier the example I was setting earlier, it's way easier to write, you know, descriptions for a big, ornate Gothic mansion than it is to draw it, for sure. But like I said, writing, I have to be really focused on the act of doing it, whereas drawing, I'm practiced enough at it that I can kind of just zone out a lot. So, I don't know. I don't know that you can really do a straight up and down, one's harder, one's easier. It kind of just depends on where I'm at in any given day, you know? Alright, let's start with Teddy here. Oh. See, I'm trying to find a good angle so you guys can kind of see what we just did, but also where we're going with it. Now let's just zoom in. We'll fill this out as we go. Sorry for all the jostling. Yeah, I definitely go through phases. I find that whatever aspect of the story I'm working on, I always end up having the desire to do the other thing. So if I'm drawing a lot, I'm like, man, I just can't wait till I'm at a phase where I'm like writing whatever the next thing is. And if I've spent months writing, I'm like, man, I just can't wait to sit down and draw. So the easiest thing is whatever I'm not doing currently. Are there times that you end up liking a side character more than your main character? Almost never more than the main character. The main character is the main character because I like them the most. They're the one I have the most interest in. They're the star of the show because they're the one I'm just the most obsessed with drawing or writing about. I do have this thing that happens sometimes where a side character will become kind of a bigger deal than I originally meant them to be. The most prominent example of this is in the Deep Haven mystery books. There is a sort of antagonist who is a prefect at the school named Patience Sleepwell, who is very glamorous and very lovely and very friendly and very sinister, and it turns out is kind of a witch. And she was just meant to be kind of an obstacle for the protagonist of that book to maneuver around. But every time I wrote her, it was just so fun to like write in her voice and just kind of explore her motivations and just her whole character, that she ended up becoming a much bigger deal than I intended. And now she's like one of the main characters of the book series. She occupies a lot of space in the story. And so she went from just kind of being an obstacle for the protagonist to being like the protagonist's like frenemy, just because I just kept writing her. It was just so much fun. And then when they got adapted for audiobook, the narrator Elena Ray did such a cool job voicing that character specifically that now whenever I write for Patience, I hear Elena's voice for her in my head. I wanted there to be a pretty extreme size difference between these two characters, just because the wolf, his character needed to be very like physically imposing and, at least initially, quite threatening to Teddy. He kind of fulfills the function of an antagonist, at least in these kind of early stages of the story. I don't want to get into spoilers too much, but while she's live streams with my daughter, she's a big fan of your Deep Haven series. Oh, thank you so much. Hello to you both. Where are your family in your stories? Do any characters give you inspiration? This is a loaded question. Erica Anderson is my sister. How can I answer this without getting in trouble? Yeah, of course. Basically everyone I know informs my stories in some way or another. I tend not to directly base my characters on any one specific person. I don't think you could point to people in my life and be like, that's so-and-so. The exception to that is there is a big sister in the Estranged series that is based on Erica. If you're familiar with those books, Alexis is pretty directly based on my big sister. But no, mostly what I'll take are little mannerisms or like turns of phrase, or I don't know, nothing direct. I think a lot of my characters have more in common with me necessarily than like friends and family, just because I'm easier to reference. You know, I'm here. These particular characters aren't based on anyone in particular either, but you know, they're informed by my own emotions or the emotions and backgrounds of people I know, and you know, I think that's just being an artist, is you just kind of take inspiration from the people and things around you. Going pretty fast so far. Like I said, this is like a pretty zoomed in character page. These are always kind of fun to draw because, you know, it's the stuff I have the most practice doing, is just drawing these characters. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but when I'm in the writing phase of a story, I have my sketchbook out a lot, and I spend a lot of time doodling the main characters over and over and over again in different poses, different angles, different attitudes. Partially as a way to like practice for the actual graphic novel drawing, so that I have as good of a grasp on their shape language as I can before I start drawing the actual book. But it also kind of helps me to like get to know the characters. I'll sometimes sort of discover, you know, the way they act from, you know, how they hold themselves, the kind of facial expressions they make, little like physical idiosyncrasies. I'll figure those out while I'm drawing them more than while I'm writing them, so it can kind of inform the writing. Do you know how many drawings/paintings will be in this new book? I don't, and it kind of depends on what you mean by individual drawings and paintings. If you count individual panels, probably 1,000 or so. Page-wise, this is probably going to be roughly like a 250-page book altogether. Might be a little bit more, maybe a little less. So, a lot. They kind of just, I don't know if you can see it in this shot, not really, but there's a shelf back here where every time I finish a page, I just stack it on top, and you get a pretty good sized stack by the end of this. How do you find inspiration for your characters? Again, some of it just kind of comes from things I see in life. I'll also do a lot of like observational sketches while I'm out and about, and if I like see a really interesting person or a cool outfit or, you know, a cool way of doing hair or an interesting attitude, I'll kind of make little sketches based on it. But I'm always kind of doodling in my sketchbook and making up new characters, and you know, just following impulses, trying out new designs, new looks, and some things just kind of stick. A lot of times, the characters will be very informed by the story itself. So if I have a character like in Deep Haven, where the protagonist of Deep Haven, Nev, is a very like withdrawn, quiet, kind of keeps to themselves character. So I designed Nev with like this big overcoat that they could kind of hide in. You know, Teddy, the protagonist of this book, he's got anger management issues. He lashes out a bunch, and so he's like very kind of prickly looking. He's got the zigzag pattern on his sweater that I sort of wanted to convey this like very tightly coiled aspect to. The little like squiggly lines that are you can kind of see it here under his jacket. he doesn't wear this jacket for most of the story. It's just because he's just come from outside. But that's another like little design motif I wanted to put in there just to kind of suggest that he's a very like tightly wound kind of person. So things like that. Sometimes whatever the character is in the story will inform how they look. But yeah, characters are kind of like stories themselves. It's kind of hard to articulate where it comes from exactly, because a lot of it's just, things from my notebook where it's just observations, thoughts, my own emotions, my own interests in terms of like what I would like to draw, how I like to draw it. It's also informed by things I don't like to draw. Like I don't have a lot of like robots in my comics because I don't like to draw really complex like machinery. My daughter does quite a bit of fan art of Nev. She wants to know how you draw the patterns on their coat. Similar to how I draw the patterns on the sweater. Nev's jacket is one of my favorite things to draw because it's just mark making. I can show you up in this little margin here, but it's just literally just I go down, the length of their jacket and I just make these little like hatch marks. Like it's just this easy, and then I go back and I just do the opposite direction. You just alternate like that, and it creates this kind of fun herringbone pattern. But I have this sort of squiggly pattern that sort of fulfills that same function on Teddy. Right now I'm drawing this kind of like crisscross quilted pattern on this character's like big house coat that he wears. That's the other thing. A lot of the design for the characters is like clothes that I kind of want to wear, wish that I had, Who's your favorite character you've created? Oh, I couldn't possibly pick. It's like asking to choose one of my children. In terms of favorites, it's almost always like whatever I'm working on currently. So right now, Teddy is my favorite character. I really like drawing him. He's very fun to draw. He's very prickly. But they're all fun. I love drawing Nev. I love drawing Danny from the Deep Haven books. I love drawing Alto from The Legend of Brightblade. Agatha from The Pale Queen. She had all these like really great round swooping shapes. She was very fun to ink. I don't know, it's just whatever I'm working on at the time is usually my favorite. In terms of like characters that are most fun to write, I don't know. Again, it's just whoever the focus is. Alright, I'm gonna focus for right now on inking the characters, and then I'll go in later and do the backgrounds. We'll see if I get to that on the stream today. We might just have a very character-centric stream. So the other thing to keep in mind when I'm inking is that I'm doing most of the lighting with the ink as well. I'm doing very minimal lighting with the watercolor. And so shadows also need to be rendered in ink. So here, there's like a dim light coming from this area, so the wolf is backlit, and Teddy's kind of stuck in his shadow. So I'm gonna add a bunch of hatch lines just to really darken the wolf, and then I'll darken him a little bit more once I get to the painting. Which, again, we're not going to get to that on stream today, but there will be future streams where you guys can see the painting process. Or you can subscribe to my Patreon, where you can see the video on demand of past live streams, and there's a couple of painting ones on there. But this kind of hatching, this really is like my favorite part, because it is just, no thoughts, head empty, making marks on paper. It's like the most basic form of drawing to me, where I'm not worried about perspective so much. I do think about volume a little bit, because you can see that like I'm curving these hatch marks a little bit, and with that curve you can kind of create the illusion of volume and heft. You can see I'm kind of curving them around like how a sleeve would normally curve. So even though this is a flat two-dimensional drawing, by curving these little hatch lines, it kind of gives the impression that there's a roundness to it. And I find that these like really intense hatch marks when I'm doing these big shadows like this can kind of give a drawing a sense of drama. I'm kind of doing them at this angle so that they kind of act as a texture that kind of brings attention down to Teddy here. Because once this is painted, he's going to be lost in quite a bit of dark, and so I still want to be able to, the reader to be able to spot him very easily. So the shadows from the wolf are kind of pulling down towards him. I've said this before on past live streams. There's a lot of considerations when you're working on a comic. You obviously want a thing to be pretty. You want it to convey the emotion you need it to convey. But I do think, at least as far as comics and illustration go, book illustration, the end-all be-all, your sort of guiding light, your main goal should always be readability. Whoever is reading the book or the webcomic should be able to just glance and understand the main point of what's going on. And, you know, I enjoy putting lots of little details in, and I like a book where, you know, the longer a reader kind of sits and stares at an image, the more it kind of reveals to them. But the main point of whatever a drawing is should be, your reader should be able to apprehend it immediately upon looking at it. If they have to like kind of decipher it, you've lost them. That's just kind of my personal ethos on it. Travis asks, when you're creating drawing characters, do you normally work on one project, or can you work on multiple projects at once? That's a good question. Thank you. I can work on multiple projects at once. I prefer not to as much as possible. Just because I really like being able to sink into a project. Like, it just kind of takes up all the room in my head. I'm able to just think about those characters, their emotions, the story, the setting, just really kind of like soak in the texture of it. That said, publishing deadlines are what they are. I live in New York City and it's very expensive, so you know, you got to take on some jobs to pay the rent. And so lots of times I'm obligated to take on multiple projects at once, and a lot of times, just because of how publishing deadlines work, I'll be wrapping up work on one project while I start work on another, while I'm in the middle of, you know, a third. And that happens a bunch. I just released a book that I illustrated called The Cursed Catacombs, which is a playable novel. You can find it in bookstores now. But that was one I worked on. I drew that while I was writing this comic. And so when I do stuff like that, when I have to work on multiple projects at once, I try to only work on one project in a day. So I'll, you know, 2 or 3 days out of a week, I'll work on one, and then 2 or 3 I'll work on another. Just so that I can still like get into that exclusive headspace, because otherwise I find that the tones kind of mix and muddle, and I like to be able to focus on just one thing at a time as much as I can. I also find that as I get a little bit older, that it's a little bit harder for me to divide my attention between the two. My preference is definitely just to work on one thing at a time, but sometimes needs must. I'm really liking how this is coming out so far. So you can see why I like using this dip pen. I have not used a different pen this whole drawing, but you can see how light and wispy these hatch marks are down here on his shirt compared to how thick this line is on his like shawl collar. That's just done with like how much pressure I'm putting on the pen, because it's got these two little tines is what they're called. And so when I'm not putting much pressure, they're just together, they're forming a single point, but if I push a little bit, they spread apart slightly so that I can create a wider line. And you can kind of do it within the same line. I've shown this before on a stream, but with a dip pen, some fountain pens do this too, but dip pens kind of do it best, where you can kind of create this really thin line and then push a little bit and make it really thick. You can see like just the amount of variation I'm able to get out of a single pen. It makes for a very like fluid, dynamic drawing. Filling in this sleeve, and then we'll ink Teddy in the last panel. Yeah, but you see what I'm saying? Like it's really easy when you're doing this dense hatching just to kind of zone out. It's very meditative, you know? If I was a therapist, I think I would prescribe doing this. Just give them a really nice, smooth fountain pen or a dip pen, big sheet of paper, and just say, make marks. Don't even draw anything, just make marks. All right. That's looking pretty good. We're going to keep focused on the characters for now, so I'm going to pull down here and ink Teddy in this last panel. And we'll go back up and do the background. I was talking a bit earlier about how I'm still kind of trying to figure out the shapes of animal characters like this, like things like his snout. It just does different things to a face and expression when you sort of turn it in a three-dimensional way. And I'm still kind of figuring out the logic of that. One of the nice things about animal characters is they have more modes of expression than a human character would. So with a human character, most of the facial expression is communicated through eyebrows. A little bit through the mouth, a little bit through the eyes, but it's mostly just the eyebrows. That's true with like a sort of anthropomorphized animal character like this too, but I can also use things like the direction of their ears and also like what their tail is doing. And that's really fun to play with because you can really, it can really give a reader an interesting insight into their emotions and thoughts. So, you know, Teddy's face here is he's very snarling and defiant at this old wolf, but you can see that his ears are laid flat back because he's angry here, and the more this wolf leans over him, the more his ears kind of go down, so that even though his face is still just as angry, you can kind of see just from that one little detail that I wouldn't get with the human character that like he's scared, you know, he's afraid of this character. He is being successfully intimidated. Now, Teddy's also very stubborn, so what's happening in this page is this old wolf is telling him to leave the house, and you know, because this is a ghost story and a haunted house story, Teddy will not be doing that. So he can intimidate as much as he likes. You can't do much against a stubborn teenager. But again, you can see like how thick the line I'm using on for Teddy's hair here. Line thickness is another thing you can use to communicate depth. So this edge is going to have a little bit of a highlight, so I'm going to use a thinner line, and then the parts that are going to be in shadow, I'll use a thicker line. Just little tricks to give the illusion of depth and volume and weight. it's all a flat 2D surface, but there's all these little like things you can do to fool the eye, and if you do it well, the viewer will never even notice that you're doing it. It's like a magic trick. I think if the average person notices like all my little tricks of like line width and shadow and hatching, then it's pulling too much attention to itself. You should, the hope is that you sort of, it's so natural that you just kind of get lost in the story. Like you forget that these are even drawings. You're just reading a story with living, breathing characters. And all the little tricks I'm using are just to facilitate the ease with which you can kind of sink into that. Do you ever name a character and as you draw them decide that name doesn't fit them and have to change their name? Yes. This character is a good example of that. The protagonist of this is named Teddy James. In all of the original notes, he was named Simon. I was sort of developing this story and these characters in my sketchbook for a couple years before I actually sat down and wrote it. And so for about a year or so, this character's name was Simon, and he just didn't really feel like a Simon the more I drew him. I don't even remember how I ended up at Teddy. He just kind of looked more like a Teddy to me, you know? Naming characters is very difficult for me most of the time. It's almost as hard as picking titles for books. Picking a title for a book is always, always, always the hardest thing for me. I'll say that like settling like definitively on a name for a character is always the last stage of their development for me. There's a couple exceptions to that. For my other graphic novel, The Legend of Brightblade, Alto was always named Alto. It's just when I started drawing him, I just knew that's what his name was. And even I changed all the other characters' names. They were all named something different originally, but his name was always just Alto. But almost every other character I've written or drawn, they'll have one name in the early notes, and then it almost always changes. Naming books, though, I find that almost impossible. I really wish, you know, it's not a thing, but I really wish publishers had like a person whose job it was to come up with good titles, because I find it so difficult. And even if I come up with a title I really like, lots of times my publisher will disagree. I've talked about this in the past, but The Legend of Brightblade was originally titled The Wandering Hearth, which I still think is a really good title. But they felt it kind of conveyed the wrong tone, so we went with The Legend of Brightblade. Another example of that is basically, like, the entire time I was drawing it, up until it was time to like almost go to publication, my most recent graphic novel, The Pale Queen, was titled The Lady's Favor. That was its title for a long, long time, even after I sold it to a publisher, while I was working on it, while we were putting it together. And then it was kind of it was sort of decided at the last minute that it sounded a little bit, The Lady's Favor sounded a little bit too much like a Regency romance, which was not quite the vibe we were going for. And I got that, I understood that, I agreed. So we went with The Pale Queen instead, which kind of gives more of that eerie sort of folk horror fairy tale vibe, which I think is much more appropriate to the actual tone of the book. But if you've read it, The Lady's Favor had a sort of nice, like, double or triple entendre to it. But it did kind of give a not quite the tone we wanted. Alright, here's Teddy. So like I said, in the scene here, there's a dim light coming from behind the characters. So the wolf is backlit. Teddy is standing in his shadow. So here I'm going to actually I should probably wait for this to dry, or at least angle. So let me angle it. Teddy's going to be standing in his shadow. Let me draw his tail first here from this angle. But I'm actually going to use hatch lines to do the shadow, just so it looks really defined and scary. The other fun thing I'm learning with animal ears is you can kind of sharpen them in shadows like this to like make like devil horns, just so it's like extra sinister. I'm playing a lot with shadows in this one just because it is a gothic horror story, and one of the great things about the aesthetics of gothic stories is there's a lot of like shadow play that happens. And I love that. It's just another way to like bring in a mood and an atmosphere, even for a character or an element of the setting that's not actually in the shot. Just a bunch of fun different tools to play with. If it's not clear just yet, this is like sort of a top-down view. This is almost like how the old wolf can see him. The wolf has a name. It's sort of held off on. His name's Graham. There's not really any reason to keep it a secret. It's not like, oh, I understand so many things about him now. The wolf's name is Graham. Him and Teddy are the two sort of primary characters of the story. Like I said, if you want to read a little bit more about both of them, go ahead and head on over to SABLEcomic.com. You'll find the teaser comic for this there. The actual story is already up and running on Patreon, which you can subscribe to now. But the webcomic will launch publicly on August 19th, which is coming up very fast. I have had this story cooking for a long time. If you have followed me for a while, I think the first... there might have been another like illustration or two I posted earlier, but I posted a little looping animation years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that I titled Night Traffic. That was sort of like based on that thing of, you know, when you're asleep in bed and a car drives past outside and the sort of light comes through your window and it slides across the wall of your bedroom. I did a little looping animation with this character where he's looking out of the window as a car goes past and the light hits like this horrible like ghost thing in the background. That was some very early like animated concept art for this story. If you go on to sablecomic.com and read the teaser story, you'll find that exact scene in the comic. So even though I haven't been like dedicatedly working on this story until maybe 7 or 8 months ago, I've been sort of simmering it in the background for years. And that's pretty typical of how I work on all of my stuff. Travis asked earlier about if I work on more than one thing at a time. And when I say I like to work on one thing at a time, what I mean is I like to work on production, like what I'm doing right now, for one thing at a time, as much as I can feasibly manage. But I'm always simmering over things in the background. My sketchbook and the little, like, I bring like a little pocket notebook with me everywhere I go. And there's constantly little things simmering. Some are ideas that I'll, you know, that strike me as interesting at the time, and then when I'll come back and look at them later, they're actually not really that compelling, or it's been done, or, you know, it's just not, it doesn't grab my attention the way it did at first. But I know that if I keep coming back to a thing again and again, if I do drawings of it, if I keep thinking about it, then I'll know that there's something about an idea that strikes me. And that's something that I'll kind of slowly develop over time into a story. And sometimes, you know, I'll work on developing a thing and it fizzles out. And sometimes it doesn't. But that's what a sketchbook is for. It's just a place to experiment, try out ideas, even if they don't end up going anywhere. And sometimes they do, like this. Travis says, you said earlier that sometimes the publisher could suggest a title change. have they ever asked to sway a story in a different way than the way you wrote it or created it? That's a really good question. The way I think you're thinking of it, no. When you work with a traditional publisher, the main person you're interfacing with is an editor. And yes, they do suggest story changes, add a scene, remove a scene, change the dialogue here. But in my experience, it's almost always in service of trying to figure out what I'm trying to communicate with a scene or a character or a story, and they are trying to help me communicate that in as clear a way as possible. And so, yes, sometimes an editor will suggest a revision that is a pretty big change to a story, but it's usually not like a fundamental change to what I'm trying to do overall with a story. I'm trying to think of a concrete example. So I've got one. So for The Legend of Brightblade, for those who haven't read it, it's very different than this book. It's a very lighthearted, like road trip fantasy adventure. It's about a battle of bands that, a bunch of magical bards go out on the road, and they end up sort of fighting with a rival bard troupe who is working on a conspiracy to overthrow the kingdom. And in the original pitch that I sent to my publisher, every person, location, thing had like a musical pun name. And it was all very like music based and musical based, and it was just a very music focused story. And my publisher said, change all of that. Don't do any of that. And it wasn't because like they wanted to just completely rewrite my intent with the story. They could just tell from the plot itself and the character itself that I was trying to tell a very emotionally grounded fantasy story, even in this sort of lighthearted fantasy world. But the fact that everyone had a pun name and all the things had a pun name, it just took the audience out. It took the reader out of it. And I couldn't see that at the time on my own. And so sometimes you need that kind of outside perspective. But once they kind of went over with me, I could see that they were right, and that by changing things to more realistic names, except for Alto, like I said, who's the protagonist, his name stayed the same. It kind of helped realize my own vision better. So yes, sometimes they will suggest big changes, but usually it's in service of what I'm trying to do. I can't think of very many like big arguments I've had with my publisher. I write a lot of queer characters and queer themes, and I've never had a pushback on that. Sometimes I'll get suggestions. Like there's a bit of a romantic element in The Pale Queen, where we were trying to figure out like how fast the romance should progress, especially in a middle grade book, and the depth of that romance. And then so there was some back and forth on that, but it wasn't like, no, we don't think you should do this. They're very good to sort of respect the vision of what I'm trying to do. Is there a book of yours that you would want to see created into a movie/series? Again, this is one of those ones where it's always whatever I'm working on. I would love to see SABLE done in an like animated film, like stop motion animated film. I think it could, like, if you do it like Coraline or Fantastic Mr. Fox or something like that, I think it would look really cool. I think Deep Haven would make a really cool live action movie. I would obviously be delighted to have any of my books adapted for film, but yeah, I think some of them would be difficult. Like, I think the Estranged books would be cool, but very hard to do in film, just because they are so odd. They were very influenced by like dark fantasy movies from the 1980s, especially like Jim Henson films like Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal. And I think it would be kind of hard to make a movie like that these days. But I think Sable would be cool as a fully animated film. I think Deep Haven would be cool as a live-action film. The Pale Queen would be kind of cool. I think you would have to do that like Labyrinth, where there's a lot of human characters and then like just like a couple Muppets running around, you know? Legend of Bright Blade, that one could be an animated film. I think it would look kind of odd live action, that one. My husband and I recently watched an animated film called K-Pop Demon Hunters on Netflix, which was very, very good. It reminded me a lot of The Legend of Bright Blade, just because it's a very like music-focused fantasy epic. Alright, so you can see with that background detail, it's a little more clear that you're like looking down at Teddy. To be honest, this I'm not going to mention it. I made a slight mistake, but I don't think it's obvious, so I'm not going to say anything. Alright. I don't know. Let me go ahead and put in the background details of this one. So I'm kind of doing these like echoing arches here. This is another little visual trick to suggest depth. You can kind of echo the same shape, but like get it smaller and smaller at an angle, and that kind of suggests like a depth to a drawing. And I'm actually gonna lower this window. I think it should be down like here. I'm using a thicker line right here than I normally would to draw something this far in the distance, but this is all going to be black in the end, so it doesn't really matter. Want to goof this up too much. When I'm drawing backgrounds like this, I'll sometimes use a ruler to like draw out the perspective lines, but mostly I just kind of fudge it, you know? I know some creators, especially if you're doing something like a science fiction book, you know, really rigid perspective is a little more important. I'm kind of lazy about it, but also I like a really good organic shape. And so I'm not super concerned with like having everything at really correct angles or lines. Also, in the real life, it's kind of hard to find those unless you're in like a brand new building. Even in buildings, like especially older ones like this house is supposed to be, you know, things kind of sag over time, things list at odd angles. It just kind of depends. So a little bit of inconsistency can actually really help give an organic life to a thing. At least that's what I tell myself as an excuse to not worry about perspective grids. Alright. Keeping this one pretty simple. Let me just double check real quick. I'm looking at past pages to make sure I'm getting all of my details consistent. Alright, there's a detail. Okay. So that is, for the most part, the ink drawing. I'm going to be doing a little bit of brushwork. It might be a little bit much to have on the stream today, but I can show you at least a little bit of like how this is going to look up on this close-up of Graham up here. So if you've seen this on past live streams, if you've been on, I'm just using an old brush here. I get these sort of Japanese calligraphy brushes for a lot of my watercolor work, and they have these really fine points, and the points wear out over time. They kind of soften up. And so I got new brushes, new watercolor brushes for this project. But the old brushes, you know, apart from being a little blunted, are still good. And so what I've been doing is these get turned into ink brushes. The ink kind of tends to cake up the bristles. It really stiffens it up. I can't really bend that brush anymore. It's stiff like a pen point, but I can use it for filling in these big spot blacks. So even if it wears out for painting, I can still use it for inking. So you can see that gives it a lot more like pop. There's a lot more drama to that. A little bit down here as well by his neck, just to like make it like a light gradient, you know. Then I'm gonna do a little bit here. So this is gonna be a very like hard shadow on this side of the arch. There's a lot of this in the book. I don't do a lot of these like big spot blacks usually. In a lot of my past graphic novels, this would be done with watercolor. But, you know, this is a Gothic story. I'm looking at a lot of like old German expressionist horror films, and they have these big kind of looming shadows over everything. And so I'm kind of trying to imitate that look. Sorry, you guys can't really see what I'm doing, right? My face is taking up the corner of the drawing I'm working on. You can see how as the brush dries, I'm just kind of using it to feather the angle of these lines down here, and then I'll go in with a pen later and do the hatch marks so it blends nice and smooth. It kind of creates that illusion of light. And then this is... Red Owl just says, love the clawhound on top of the cane. Great gestures. Thank you. Yeah, I like drawing all the claws. They're very fun to draw. Very expressive. Now the question is, can I fill in this spot black without ruining that gesture? Keep away from these actual claws because I do like how that looks. And then I'll go in with a pen to hatch around it later, just to preserve that motion. Oh, I forgot that this little arch up here needs to be in black too. Pull you guys out a little bit so you can kind of see the dynamic this is creating. So there will be a lot of like hatch marks up in here and over here later. Again, just to kind of give that drawing texture and to sort of create the illusion of light. The other nice thing about doing big spot blacks like this, it hasn't come up so much on this page, but I can use it to hide a lot of, a lot of fudging with the perspective. You can't tell if my perspective lines don't line up if it's all just drowned in ink. Alright. And then at least for this little background bit, I think I'm going to use a fountain pen just so I can be really precise and careful with it. So this is the fountain pen I use to ink sometimes. This is a Noodler's Ahab Flex, and it's filled with a carbon platinum ink, which is one of the very few fountain pen inks that is waterproof once dry, or water resistant at least. But this will kind of give you an idea of what's going to happen to the rest of the drawing. This will probably be the last little section I work on the stream today. Thank you guys all so much for tuning in. And thank you all for the questions. There was a lot of family members on the stream today. That's always nice. If you guys would like to read more about the story, once again, you can go to SABLEcomic.com. It's got the teaser comic up on there. And if you would like to see this live stream, if you missed the beginning of it, or if you'd like to see past Sunday's live stream, go ahead and subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/Ethan Aldridge. All past live streams are saved there for subscribers in the Wolf and Wraith tiers. And the webcomic is up and running already on Patreon. I think we are on to page 9 or 10 of chapter 1. So it is a good ways along so far. the story will launch publicly August 19th. So that's going to be very soon. I'll be sure to be posting on all of my social media when that happens. I can't wait to share it with you guys, and you'll get to know both these characters quite a lot very soon.